There's a side of me often missed in history. The human side. The woman. But even when I wore man's clothes, I was never trying to pretend to be anything than who I was. Calamity Jane. Calamity Jane, in a delicate condition, wearing the bustle wrong, as bold as brass. Well, that sure did show folk I was all woman. Heroine of 1,000 thrilling adventures. I could swear like a trooper, drink like a sailor, rough it with the roughest, and I could make new life too. They say there's nothing like the pain of bearing a child. They don't speak much of the spaces between them pains that give you the chance to take a breath, to relax. And how the last part is the best part. I became the mother of a girl baby, the very image of its father, but with the temper of its mother.
When we talk of childbirth being dangerous in the past, what do we mean? Is childbirth itself a dangerous act, or are there things that make childbirth dangerous? The 1800s were a time of living in filth. Poor housing, hygiene and dirty water before sanitation and plumbing put a stop to widespread disease like smallpox and cholera. Mothers and babies died from malnutrition, STDs and bad birth care. Even basic lack of hand washing led to decades of lives lost to puerperal fever. The Wild West was also a time of great upheaval and life on the road, with hard physical work making bearing a new life a dangerous toll on a woman. One of those mothers of the Wild West who survived, and whose babies survived, was Martha Canary, better known as Calamity Jane. I started to research into childbirth in the Wild West, and the main message you get is how dangerous and awful it was to give birth in the Wild West. I felt there was more to it because there were obviously births that were simple and uncomplicated, and I wanted to find out more about them. And I started to realise that there could be a really good opportunity here to make a powerful distinction between childbirth being inherently dangerous and childbirth being made dangerous by a bunch of mitigating factors. Today's quality of living has eradicated many of the things that once made birth dangerous. Modern medicine has a lot to thank for. I think these days we all know someone who would be dead if it weren't for a caesarean section or antibiotics. But it's overly simplistic to assume medicine has made everything okay. One of the things that can still endanger us today is the over-intervention of modern medicine itself. So it's not so black and white. I wanted to find out more about women's stories. So I started to read the women's diaries. Even women in their diaries wouldn't write about everything. They wouldn't even say they were pregnant half of the time. And then I started to look at Calamity Jane, the real Calamity Jane, not the blonde Doris Day Hollywood image. And these images I found to be so compelling, they drew me in to wanting to find out more about this woman. Born around 1852, she's a best-known heroine of the American Wild West. She was known as both this coarse, disreputable outcast and this generous-hearted, courageous woman compared to Joan of Arc and Florence Nightingale. She was a mother. It's disputed whether she had 2, 3 or 4 children. Her first child was a son, who later died in childhood, but her daughters survived into adulthood. Calamity Jane is one of those figures whose lives were full of all kinds of embellishment. She wrote lies about her own life. How do I find out about Calamity Jane giving birth? I had to make my own narrative, just like all the films and books that have been made about figures of the Wild West. It became my task to fill in the gaps, and that's what I'm doing today. Imagining to myself what it might have looked like, stripping down her masculine garb and depicting her in this ultimately female act of making new life. I haven't shot it yet in this position, so I'm thinking I might try this position. Really darn good, isn't it? Art, darling, art!
As long as you don't put an F on that. In the last 2 years, Nat has become the UK champion of applying fake blood.
The Wild West was this great time of upheaval. Calamity Jane was part of that time. She was an alcoholic, she was a prostitute, she smoked, she drank, she had all these vices. She spent time around minors with smallpox, and she died young in her 50s. And yet she still bore new life on the crest of that wave of upheaval. I find that fascinating, to be able to create this image of a part of history that's not shown so much. You know, we don't tend to hear much about childbirth other than the horror stories. We don't hear about the normality and the banality of it.
You're right there. I'm using two women beside Calamity, one as a midwife figure catching her baby, and the other as a helper figure on the other side, to try and show birth as it always was, traditionally this female preserve.
She bore offspring and left her legacy behind, and so that was my hook.
I think we should come round a little bit more. I want to see the end of that church. At the moment it's just chopping it off.
The image I'm making isn't entirely literal. I'm not necessarily saying that women gave birth outside. I'm using the Wild West street as this narrative of worlds all happening at once.
To really make people feel like they're transported back to the era.
3, 2, 1.
Who's this?
Oh my god, look! She looks great. I'm using the children as devices to anchor the male and female worlds in the image.
Maybe only me.
Where's her pram? Where are you going? Lilith, my daughter, she's a kind of analogy of the whole image. Girl with pram, the passing down of female legacy.
He's hot.
I'm portraying Wild Bill Hickok. Although we don't know for sure whether he was the father, he's the male figure most famously associated with Calamity. She spoke fondly of him in her last days, and she's actually buried next to him.
Right, so let's have you standing next to the wagon.
I've styled him with inspiration from Buffalo Bill Cody to evoke Calamity's showgirl days. Wild Bill will lead this male side to the image, along with cowboy characters, wagon, guns and horses, to represent this outer public world of the Wild West.
We're doing a photo shoot.
It's been an interesting journey for me to do this research. It's been a long time coming. I've had another baby, Sky. You know, I've been reading about the Wild West through being pregnant, even in the early contractions of labour. I was watching a Calamity Jane documentary, you know, and there's pictures of Calamity Jane coming up on the screen while I'm in labour, and it's almost like making me think about what it would have been like for her to give birth back in the 19th century.
To me, it wasn't pain. When I saw of them poor smallpox folk sick as horses on the brink of cashing in, that's what pain is. Still, there was terror in not knowing whether bringing in a new life would put you in the bone orchard. Was it really this woman's business that was dangerous, or the way we lived